So we are very excited at the Kansas Biological Survey to hear about the formation of this House Committee on Water. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to talk about work being conducted at the Biological Survey, all of which relates to our mission, which is to serve Kansas and the global environment through world-class research, education, and outreach. Water issues are prevalent and vary across the state, ranging from high demand and scarcity in the West, where many of our agricultural lands are, to increasing variability and intermittency of streams in our rangelands, to declining water quality and quantity in our reservoirs for drinking. So I have several goals with this presentation today. First, I'm going to review the history of the Biological Survey and how it has expanded over time, as well as our expertise and infrastructure for research. And then I'd like to show you how survey data are used in statewide applications. Then I'll transition into presenting some of our current research on water dynamics in Western farmlands and Eastern floodplains in Kansas. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ted Harris, who's going to provide you a summary of harmful algal bloom research in Kansas. And then we'll leave you with some key takeaways. So organized efforts to survey the biota of Kansas actually started in the 1860s, but the Biological Survey was not formally established until 1911 by the chancellor at the University of Kansas. In 1959, House Bill 133 recognized the Biological Survey as a unit of state government. However, we are a non-regulatory state agency, and we are not a line item in the Kansas budget like the Kansas Geological Survey. Our mandate is to survey the animals and plants, particularly those that are native and of economic and educational importance in Kansas, to publish our reports and our findings, to receive and administer lands that are needed by the state, to study and preserve native animals and plant resources, and then lastly, to accept grants and state monies or any gifts and donations. The Biological Survey has expanded in its scope over time. In 1986, the Kansas Natural Heritage Inventory was established by the legislature to survey ecologically important sites across the state, and it became part of the Biological Survey. About 11 years later, in 1997, the Kansas Applied Remote Sensing Program, also called CARS, which was originally established in 1972 by NASA and the state, to conduct research on applications of satellite imagery and technology, was also folded into the survey, and I will talk about some of their current work today. In 1999, the KU field station that was originally established in 1947 became administered by the survey, and I'll give you some details on the field station in this talk today. Lastly, Monarch Watch is affiliated with the Biological Survey, and this is an internationally visible, not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the education, conservation, and research on the monarch butterfly. So our budget comes from KU, and it's oscillated around $1.8, $1.9 million per year over the last 3 fiscal years. The source of these dollars come from a variety of places. So some of our funding could come from tuition dollars, endowments, federal work study, as well as then funding that's coming from the state general fund. So the relative proportion of those dollars are decisions that are made at much higher levels than my position. And so when I receive the budget, it's primarily for positions that are funded by KU and other operating expenses. So FY21 right now, we have 24 positions that are partially funded by the University of Kansas at the Biological Survey. So we have 13 split appointed faculty with KU departments. So they tend to be 50% Biological Survey, 50% a department. We have 3 scientists that are partially self-funded from grants and contracts. And we have 5 administrative staff, 4 at the Biological Survey and 1 at the KU field station, and 2 project support staff or research support staff that are also partially funded by the budget coming to the Biological Survey. Other operating expenses, just to give you an example of what those funds are used for example, if the Biological Survey needs to attend a Kansas Water Authority meeting in Western Kansas, then the cost for that travel would be charged to our other operating expenses, along with all other kinds of, supplies, office supplies that are needed to run the Biological Survey. I also included in this slide a table of our sponsored project expenditures. So these are funds that are coming largely from outside the state. The Kansas Biological Survey receives $3 to $4 million in grants and contracts every year. And many of those are multi-year awards. And so this table demonstrates the expenditures from those grants, the dollars that are being expended each year. And these numbers were supplied from KU Center for Research. And they categorize these expenditures into 2 sources. Those are non-federal funds, such as grants and contracts from the state, such as our work with the Kansas Water Office. There could be large grants from foundations to conduct research, not-for-profit organizations, industry, as well as other universities. By far, the majority of funding coming into the Kansas Biological Survey are from federal sources, like the National Science Foundation and the United States Department of Agriculture. And so these expenditures support many more people who work at the Biological Survey. We have 70 to 100 employees, many of those being researchers, many of them coming from outside of the state into Kansas. And these expenditures, most of which are coming outside the state, are spent in Kansas and stimulating this Kansas economy. So the real point I really want to make here is that the Biological Survey has an over 200% return on the state's investment. And this is because of sponsored projects. It is because of the research grants that are coming into the Biological Survey, of which over half are used in some way to study the effects of water on ecosystems and organisms. Our reporting structure is such that KU field station staff report to the director of the field station. The field station director, survey administrative staff, scientists, and split appointed faculty all report to me through annual evaluations. And then I report to the KU Office of Research. The Biological Survey produces an annual report each year, and I meet with the KU Office of Research quarterly throughout the year. There is an annual review that is conducted of the director, and there is a forthcoming 5-year review of the director, which is separate from a 5-year review of our research center. So today, the Kansas Biological Survey is one of 12 designated research centers at KU. We conduct interdisciplinary and collaborative research on plants, animals, a lot of work on microbes, their communities, whole ecosystems, nutrient cycling, changes in soil carbon, and water resources in the state and around the world. Again, we employ 70 to 100 researchers. The faculty affiliated with the survey teach classes at KU and mentor scientists at all levels. And again, most of these employees are funded by sources that are coming from outside the state, those grants and contracts. We have growing public outreach and service at all levels, from local to national. And we have an increasing infrastructure for research, not only on campus, but also at the KU field station, which has really been made possible by the extra mile, the effort that many of the faculty have gone to seek funds from the National Science Foundation Infrastructure Grant Program. So I'm going to go into some of this infrastructure for research, starting at the KU field station. Again, established in 1947, its mission is to foster scholarly research, environmental education, and science-based stewardship of natural resources. The field station consists of multiple sites that collectively contain over 3,500 acres of land. So the core site, the main site, is north of Lawrence, has a lot of different field experiments. And then just south of that is a medicinal plant garden that really involves the community, engages the community in caring for and tending to those medicinal plants. South of Lawrence is a site called Baldwin Woods, which is a really unique and interesting tract of forest. You could call it cross timbers, in that it contains a lot of eastern deciduous forest species, but also a lot of southern forest species. And so we hold annual education events out there, interpretive hikes, and then students at KU can go out there for field trips to learn about forest species, and there's also some research. The other side is Anderson Prairie, just south and not shown on the map here. But this is a large prairie area owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by the KU field station. And it is a great resource to study prairie ecosystems and how they respond to grazing. This picture here is just to demonstrate that we engage the broader community at KU. These structures here were actually designed and built by KU architecture students at the field station. Going to our core area at the KU field station and infrastructure that's available there, we have an Armitage Education Center, which is a very nice building where we can hold small conferences or lectures. It also contains laboratories where students can participate in experiential learning, take field classes. There's also a large greenhouse that contains a sample processing area. Again, this was funded by the National Science Foundation Infrastructure for Research program. And there are some small cabins that enable visiting scientists to stay at the KU field station. The field station also consists of a network of nature trails, and many of these trails have become a valuable resource for the community, particularly during this pandemic period. We engage in a lot of outreach activities, and this is just one example of a prairie restoration experiment that the Biological Survey helped set up at Free State High School. And this experiment is used by Free State High School students to get experience with the scientific method. And actually very interesting results have been published. And the community comes here to learn about tallgrass prairie restoration. Honing in a little bit more on the KU field station core area, this aerial view just demonstrates the scale and the complexity and diversity of experiments and the massive amount of infrastructure for research that's available at the KU field station north of Lawrence. The field station is also a National Ecological Observatory Network, also called NEON, site. So NEON has sites in every major ecosystem throughout the United States. And the KU field station site is a transitional forest system. And so these towers continuously measure gas flux into and out of this ecosystem. And below the tower, there's a footprint where NEON personnel come and measure plants, animals, soils, and other aspects of the ecosystem. And this nicely links us to Kansas State University, where they have two NEON sites. The prairie and agricultural sites are located at the Konza Prairie Biological Station. There are a lot of field experiments at the KU field station in grassland as well as old fields. And this is a picture of the Dimensions and Biodiversity Experiment, which is a 5-year study, and there's a companion study in China that is funded by the National Science Foundation to look at how drought affects very complex plant-soil interactions. The field station also contains many replicated ponds, and this enables us to conduct experiments. So in the past, there were several experiments on harmful pollutants, such as atrazine. And today they're used to look at factors that are affecting harmful algal blooms. Here's another kind of experimental setup. These are very large tanks where you can manipulate a variety of factors in water. And here's another one of our aquatic scientists, Amy Bergen, and she's using these tanks to test methods of remote water sensing with water testing with drones. Going off-site, the Biological Survey participates in a lot of monitoring of stream physical and biological conditions throughout the state. And then the Biological Survey also harbors a very renowned, internationally renowned expertise in aquatic biology. And so this is Jim Thorpe. He studies rivers in Kansas and around the world. And he is the author of a multi-volume series on freshwater invertebrates that's used throughout the world. Several scientists at the survey also study soil and many processes that are very relevant to sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And many of us collaborate with scientists at Kansas State University. So now I want to go into demonstrating how some survey data are used in statewide applications. So the Natural Heritage Program at the Biological Survey is the main source of information on precise locations of at-risk species. And so they receive all of these records across the state through our own inventories, but also from other agencies and other researchers. And so then these data are then used to generate maps like this so that we can visualize the occurrence and the frequency of occurrence of rare animals and rare plants and rare plant communities across the state. So the Heritage Program works very closely with other state agencies to make these records that they receive discoverable and accessible for assessment and planning throughout the state. So they receive information on these at-risk species and communities from Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, from biological surveys that we conduct, from other researchers, as well as museums. And so those data are all funneled to the Heritage Program, where they are evaluated for quality control, and then they are input and integrated with geographic information systems to basically produce maps of rare or at-risk community and species occurrences throughout the state. So these data are actually part of a larger database. So they are funneled to an international database called NatureServe, such that then national maps can be generated of these at-risk plant, animals, species, and communities, and be used for assessment and planning. The data from the Heritage Program are also used in statewide applications, like to develop the Natural Resource Planner, the Crucial Habitat Assessment tool used by wildlife managers, and to develop the State Wildlife Action Plan. The Kansas Applied Remote Sensing Program also generates a lot of maps. And so this here is an example of the green report that's developed by the CARS program. And this kind of map is generated from the CARS program that monitors cropland and rangeland vegetation productivity using satellite data. And so the satellite data basically give us an indication of greenness, and that greenness is related to plant condition and productivity. And so the CARS program generates these maps weekly to show changes in plant condition and productivity in Kansas, across the United States, and also internationally now in South America. It's a very valuable resource. So I'm going to transition into talking about some of our current work on water. But before I do that, I need to acknowledge our past contributions to water research in the state of Kansas from the Biological Survey. And one significant product from the Biological Survey was the Atlas of Kansas Lakes, which was the first attempt to calculate volume in 81 lakes and reservoirs used for drinking water in the state of Kansas. And this was enabled by conducting bathymetric studies that are used to estimate water volume in a reservoir from topographic maps. They kind of create a topographic map of that current condition, and then they are compared to old topographic maps. And from that comparison, sedimentation rate and reduction in storage volume can be estimated. So the Atlas of Kansas Lakes has these detailed measurements for these 81 lakes and reservoirs in Kansas. And we can make that available to you. We have several copies to distribute. Our current work now focuses on water dynamics in western farmlands and eastern floodplains in Kansas. And I'm going to give you a few highlights from that research. So water problems vary across the state, we know, and western Kansas is what we would call a world of water deficit. So this map illustrates that world of water deficit by these pie charts that show time in drought. And the larger the pies and the darker red and orange colors in the pies show more time in moderate to exceptional drought. And so in western Kansas, we see larger pies, larger time in extreme and exceptional drought. And so a big question that we are faced with is how can we sustain groundwater in western Kansas for the livelihood of future generations? And so one partial solution might be these small rainwater-fed wetlands that are called playas that are sprinkled all throughout western Kansas, indicated here on this map, and the green dots each representing a playa. So when times are dry, playas are exceptionally dry, demonstrated by this large crack in the earth. And when there's ample water, the playas can be too wet to farm. So they accumulate water, and that water infiltrates into the Ogallala Aquifer. To date, 22,000 playas have been mapped. 84% of those playas are cropped. They are at best marginal farmlands, and they're quite inconvenient to crop around. So this research, largely being conducted by Jude Castens in the CARS program, in collaboration with the Kansas Geological Survey, the Kansas Water Office, and EPA Region 7, is looking at the field average yield in farmlands that contain these playas. And so this picture here is a field, a farm field. And the colors represent the percent of field average yield. So the bluer and darker greener colors represent a relatively higher field average yield averaged over a 4-year period. And the warmer colors, the reds and the yellows, show lower yield relative to the rest of the field, lower average yield. And so what you see here are that the playas really stick out. You know, they really pop out from this kind of analysis. And so the question is, might farming around these playas be a win-win situation for producers with better return, not farming the playas, and a win for wildlife, providing more habitat? But as we look east, we know that Kansas experiences a world of both water deficit and water excess. And so this map here shows over the last 20 years, flooding frequency and in different counties, and then the darker blue represents higher flooding frequency. And so the question is, how can we be best prepared for when extreme flooding strikes? So this image here shows in the background the Neosho River flooding and the extent of that flooding. The bottom left-hand map here is a product of this flood mapping tool. So this real-time flood mapping tool is under development by KBS in collaboration with the Water Office and the Kansas Division of Emergency Management, ultimately to save time, money, and lives. And so this flood map here that you see produced as a result of this tool is generated from plane flown aerial imagery combined with stream gauge data on water depth to generate a flood map of the extent and depth of flooding in real time for emergency response. To the right of the flood mapping tool output here, in the right-hand corner, shows the extent of the current coverage. In other words, that which has been mapped, and the purple dots represent the stream gauges across the state, feeding real-time data into the flood mapping tool. So now I'm going to hand off to Ted Harris, a scientist at the Biological Survey, who has been studying harmful algal blooms.
Thank you, Director Baer. It's my pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, I have sort of a gooey topic to talk about, and I'll be talking about what's on my hand right there in that picture. So our surface waters can be beautiful places. Here's a picture of Wilson Lake, one of the clearest lakes in Kansas. It's a great place to be. We also need our surface waters. We require them. We require them to be clean. We do that for a number of reasons. We do that for drinking water. We also, in some cases, need it for irrigation. Surface waters are used for irrigation in Kansas. We need them to grow our domesticated livestock. And of course, we need them for recreation. But there's a little bit of a problem. In the last 20 years, a blue-green foe has emerged in our surface waters, taking them from what you see on the left, that's military marina, to what you see on the right, transforming them into these blue-green goo landscapes. And these are termed as harmful algal blooms, or HABs, H-A-B. HABs in Kansas are not your average pond scum. They're a little bit different than that. And this blue-green goo that you see in the background of this slide and on the last one is disrupting our surface waters. It's disrupting livelihoods, people that live around the lake and people that use that water. And they also cause serious costs in multiple ways. These harmful algal blooms can produce very potent toxins, some even more potent than cobra venom, extremely potent. And because they are so potent, they have poisoned numerous dogs and unfortunately many cattle in livestock ponds. So there's one of those economic sinks. And we even have to close lakes and restrict access to them because the poisons are so powerful and can be so harmful. They also produce or can produce these taste and odor compounds. Sometimes you've maybe opened your tap and you smell an earthy or musty smell. That smell actually just after rain, these little algae produce that smell and it compromises our drinking water supplies. And it's very costly. Every plant that has to deal with these compounds has about $1,000 a day cost per plant. So you can imagine all the cities on the Kansas River, when these blooms occur, having to deal with these compounds, and each of them having to deal with them individually and have these costly, not knowing when they're going to end issues. But these blooms don't always produce the toxins or compounds, and we're not really sure what that trigger is to produce them. Part of the reason why the research is so important. These blooms don't just happen on Milford, which you can see at the top left side of your screen. I also collected a bottle from that scum, and you can see that bottle is about 4 inches tall, and you can see that scum is actually about 2 inches thick. So it's not just right on the surface like an oil slick. It can really build up. But it doesn't just happen in our largest reservoir. It happens in small right there out your back door in Topeka. There's Lake Shawnee in early 2020. They happen out west in reservoirs like Sebelius or Norton, and also in Webster. Even in some of our more pristine lakes, like Canopolis, these blooms have started showing up more recently. And we also see them in Marion. When we look across the state, we can see that these blooms happen all over. So when we see that state map, you can see there are green dots located just about anywhere there is water. And that's just what's happened in the last decade. So what do these little algae need? And you have to remember that they're just tiny plants. And plants need 3 things. They need light, they need water, and they need nutrients. But of course, these algae are already in water. So really, they only need light and nutrients. And specifically, the nutrients that are important are nitrogen and phosphorus. And phosphorus in particular is going to be something you're going to see in the slides coming up. But that poses the question. What do we do with our HAB problem, with these harmful blooms? And I'm going to go over just a few of the projects that we are currently investing in. The first of those projects deals with taking sediment cores. And this seems a little abstract to jam a tube down into the mud as far back as we can go. But they're actually analogous to tree rings. So just as you could drive something sideways into that tree and go back through all those rings through time, the bottom of our reservoirs are exactly the same thing. And so we take these tubes of mud and we slice them, we dice them, and we analyze them for indicators of these blooms over time to finally figure out when changes started to occur and why they might occur. So for example, this core right here, which you'll also see on the next slide, we analyze that core for harmful algal bloom trends over time. So here you can see that we did this on Milford. That site S2, that's right across from Wakefield, a town that has been plagued by these blooms. And we wanted to find out, but when really did they start? There were some big blooms around 2011, but there were indications that they had been there before. So we went all the way back in time and constructed and reconstructed the history of Milford. And we see that right off the bat, you can see on the y-axis there, that's estimated year. And then what we have here is an indicator of harmful blooms. And you can see at first, it just sort of bounces around right there next to estimated year. These are relatively low concentrations. So for decades, Milford did not have this problem. But then sometime in the early 2000s, something happened. And all of a sudden, that signal, that indicator of these blooms, gets worse and worse and worse and worse over time. When we pair that with all the historical data that we had, we found out that now when we knew when that change occurred, we could start looking for what changed over that time span. And sure enough, one of those nutrients, in this case, ortho P, there's that phosphorus nutrient again, it increased along the same timeline as we saw in our cores. It made it clear that that was likely the culprit. And one reason why there are big projects to stop phosphorus loading, or at least prevent it and slow it down in Milford, because that has really become a culprit. But we do more than that. We also take water from Milford, we take it back to our field station. Those are those tanks you saw earlier, and we grow the same exact blooms to find out when they're going to be toxic, when they're going to produce those taste odor compounds. What really makes them grow? We found that phosphorus indeed was one of those key elements in Milford. But then once we've grown them and we've studied them, they make a great playground to try out what can be safe and cost effective at killing these blooms. And so myself and the University of Missouri and EPA Region 7, we teamed up to see what could this rock flower do to limit light, another critical element for the algae's growth. And what we found is we were able to kill 70% of that bloom through this novel geoengineering approach. So we not only grow the blooms to try to understand them, but then we try to understand what would be best to kill them and try a whole host of options. I've only gone over just a few of the projects that we've done. And really, when you break it down, all of these projects together work in concert. The bottom is that Kansas Water Office funded taking sediment cores and combining long-term data to create long-term forecasts and look for when these changes started to happen and what changes went along with them. We get a really, really good idea of what the causes are. Then we go to our field station and we grow it. We make sure that we know what that cause is, as you see in our tanks and you see in whole ponds. And of course, we also try some mitigation testing. We also do this with high school students because we have to give the next generation, as you see there from Baldwin High School, that was in 2019, we have to give the next generation the tools to understand what's happening and how to fight these blooms so that they can have clean surface water too. And then finally at the top, in conjunction with the Kansas Department of Health, the City of Lawrence, Wichita State University, EPA Region 7, and others, we install these buoys that take high frequency data. Every 10 minutes, they're collecting data. So we look at decades upon decades, and we also look at really, really short time scales to try to understand what really triggers these blooms in terms of the toxins and the taste and odor production they can make. The ultimate goal of providing a short-term forecast. Just like you get a short-term weather forecast of 3 to 5 days, we want to do the same thing for harmful algal blooms. So I want to thank Director Baer for letting me share this with you and turn it back over to her for some takeaway messages. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So again, we're really appreciative of being able to present our work at the Kansas Biological Survey to the House Committee on Water. And we want to leave you with a few thoughts. And one is that we hope that this presentation has enlightened you all about the range of theoretical and applied research that's being conducted at the survey, much of which does address water quality and quantity in Kansas. Second, we have many state-supported efforts to understand our water resources in Kansas. We aim to use that flood mapping tool to map flood extent in real time in order to support emergency response and really prevent human catastrophe. We are working to understand the role of playa wetlands in aquifer recharge and on farmland productivity. And as Ted presented, we are working to reveal the causes and treatments of harmful algal blooms to improve the quality of water for humans, wildlife, and recreation. So continued support will be absolutely critical for the survey to provide insight, information, and services facilitating cost-effective management of our water resources in the state into the future. And with that, we would be happy to take any questions, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Director Baer. We'll now open it up for questions for either you or Mr. Harris. So let me check out our participants. First one is Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the algal blooms and the factor of phosphorus. My understanding, and maybe it's just the area that I'm from, which is I represent the Wichita our district in the Wichita area, that phosphorus is already abundant in Kansas soil. So what would be the motivation for, I assume it's an agricultural motivation for increasing phosphorus?
Your mic is turned off.
Sorry, thank you so much. Phosphorus certainly is abundant in our soils. It's what allows us to grow crops and do our agricultural production. However, there are ways to limit that, either through stream bank stabilization, which prevents sediment and other things, and no-till. And so it at least prevents more from coming in. We still have to deal with the phosphorus that's there. And one reason why it's so important that we look at mitigation strategies for these blooms, not only on small scales, but also on large scales. And that's something that we're doing right now in Marion Reservoir. And really, our goal there, it associates with Wichita State and the Kansas Department of Health and the Environment, is essentially to give you all and to KDHE a playbook so that you can say, look, when these blooms occur, even if we're working really hard in the watershed to prevent phosphorus and nitrogen from coming into our systems and creating these blooms, what's reasonable, what's feasible, what are the economic costs of doing these treatments? There are plenty out there, and there are plenty that don't work. And so that's exactly what we're aiming to do, is come up with a way that, hey, if we have these nutrients in our water body, we know that there's going to be prolonged effects, and we have to come with a way to mitigate these blooms so that people can still recreate, and so the drinking water can still be taken and still be used from that reservoir.
Mr. Chairman, I have
sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, my K-State education is going to come out now. My background is in soils, and many of which in Kansas. And so phosphorus is a complex nutrient because it's ultimately derived from rock weathering, but then the majority of that phosphorus over time builds into an organic pool. And this organic pool is actually not readily available. And so the phosphorus that's causing the harmful algal bloom problem is an available form of phosphorus. And so that is coming from its release during tillage, but then also if there's fertilizer application. And so that available form is much more prevalent than it would be in, say, a native prairie soil, where you have high stores of phosphorus, but it's not available to be leached or run off from the environment. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. I think the bank stabilization is a very important part of that. And that's where in urban areas, creating bank stabilization around residential ponds. I live in a residential area that has 2 good-sized ponds, and bank stabilization, I think, is crucial. It is part of the drainage system for that whole part of the city. So I appreciate the education this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions this morning? I'm looking on the outside world and inside. I see none. Director, thank you. And Mr. Harris, also thank you for the presentation. I would ask that, Director, you provide us with a more detailed breakdown of number of employees and on your budget so that we can take a closer look at that. And then you mentioned the Atlas of Kansas Lakes. Is there a link to that somewhere?
I don't believe we have an electronic version of that, but we can certainly send them to the committee. We will get them there.
Okay, we appreciate that.
All right.
See, no further questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
This is Representative Carlson, and I'm sorry. May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Okay. As far as what it takes to grow the algae, so we mentioned light. Well, we know that sunshine is everywhere, hopefully, but in the Wakefield area, land management took out lots of acres of cattails, which helped shade these shallow areas. Could that be anything that would help those blooms do better, which we don't want?
I'll say that it's a very complex dynamic between the larger plants and some of these tiny plants. Really, part of that shade in our Kansas systems is the sediment. So as important as stream bank stabilization is, there are these trade-offs. And that's really what we're dealing with now in most cases, a trade-off between the blooms and how do we fix sedimentation. And that sediment, right, it makes the water very opaque, not very clear, and that can also help terminate these blooms. So we're finding on Marion. Whether or not the cattails make that big a difference is hard. The Republican River is also, which obviously flows into Milford, it's one of the largest rivers in the state. So there's a lot of nutrients and farmland that is within that district that is flowing in there. So the cattails can help store nutrients. They've also been shown to have positive effects. And again, those trade-offs are hard to find. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you than that, but I'll just say it is a complex system. And although a simple problem, the answers and solutions seem complex and like there are most certainly trade-offs involved.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions I failed to see? Do not. So once again, thank you both for the presentation. Very informative. And with that, we are adjourned.